Muy buenas tardes, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Ceci Aquino, and I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director at the Latino Coalition for a Healthy California. It is an honor to welcome you all today as we gather to center a truth that is both powerful and urgent. When we talk about the future of California, we are without a doubt talking about the Latino community. Latinos make up 40% of California's population, 40% of the state's workforce, and more than half of Medi-Cal recipients. By 2050, we will be 50% of the California population. Our community is not on the sidelines of the state. We are the backbone of its present and future. When we boast that California is the fourth largest economy in the world, we must also acknowledge the Latino contributions that get us there. And when we talk about cutting access to Medi-Cal expansions, particularly for undocumented community members, we are talking about harming the very workforce that drives our state forward. Health is a human right, but it is also a sound economic investment. Protecting Medi-Cal expansions means protecting the workers, families, and caregivers who keep California thriving. In the state today, there is much conversation about the cost of Medi-Cal, but not enough about the cost of removing coverage for our communities. That is why we at LCHC are working to shift the narrative, to show that investing in Latino health is not charity. It is a strategic investment with high returns in the form of economic strength, resilience, and growth. And today we are so proud to partner with Dr. Hayes Bautista and Dr. Finup to bring data to this story. Their powerful research on the Latino GDP lays the foundation for a policy conversation rooted in facts and equity. Today's conversation is intentionally built with leaders and decision makers in mind, including members of the Latino Caucus, budget leadership, and the governor's office. We are here to ensure that those who are in positions, privileged positions of formal power, that they have all the data they need to make informed, just, and forward-looking decisions. And now, it is my honor to welcome the amazing Dr. David Hayes Bautista, a distinguished professor of medicine and director of the Center for the Study of Latino Health and Culture at UCLA Health. He has spent over 40 years working to improve public understanding of Latinos and their health, history, culture, and contributions to California and the nation. Dr. Hayes Bautista is the founder and chief demographer of the Latino GDP Project. And the wonderful Dr. Matthew Finup, associate professor of economics and executive director of the Center of Economic Research and Forecasting at California Lutheran University. He is an applied economist who specializes in econometrics and policy analysis. CERF is an award-winning, nationally recognized forecasting center and a member of the Wall Street Journal Economic Forecasting Survey. Dr. Finup is the project director of the Latino GDP Project. Welcome to you both. Thank you for your leadership in leading this research. We are very much looking forward to your presentation. And Dr. Finup, handing it over to you first. Gracias.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here. And I want to thank very warmly the Latino Coalition for Healthy California for hosting this conversation. This is an incredible topic and an incredible time in California to be talking about the extraordinary contribution of US Latinos. The research that we're going to be releasing today is the 2025 California Latino GDP report. This is the first update for a report that was originally written in 2020, so it's the first update in 5 years. And this is part of a broad research agenda that has spanned 8 years and over 30 separate full-length reports. And the results from this most recent report are simply extraordinary and really, really, really important to highlight given the unique moment in time and given the policy discussion that's happening in Sacramento and elsewhere. So for all of this research, the Latino GDP Project, the goal is to provide a factual view of the large and rapidly growing economic contribution of Latinos in California, in various other states and metros, and across the United States. Now, today we're going to be talking about GDP, gross domestic product, as a summary statistic for the performance of Latinos living in California. Now, this begs the question, why GDP? Why gross domestic product? Well, first and foremost, GDP is a broad measure of economic activity. It's the total market value of all final goods and services produced in a particular geographic region, in this case, by a particular group of individuals in a given year. More importantly than it being a broad measure of the direct economic impact of a group, it's a nearly universal summary statistic. This is how we measure the relative size of various economies. And more importantly, it's how we measure the dynamism and the health and the performance of economies over time. And that's because GDP growth is something we care about, we want to invest in and produce more of. And the reason GDP growth is so important is because economic growth, represented by increasing GDP, results in things we deeply care about for our nation, for our state, for our communities. GDP growth results in higher standards of living, rapidly rising wages, and greater economic mobility. The opportunity for someone to be born at any socioeconomic level with the hope of climbing within their lifetime to a higher socioeconomic level, and more importantly, that their family can climb from one generation to the next and enjoy even greater prosperity. Now, what the discussion after the presentation will really focus on is that it's important to understand the drivers of growth so we can make the appropriate investments so that we can get more growth and the benefits that growth produces for all. What this research is really going to highlight is that Latinos are drivers of economic growth, a source of resilience, and again, that it produces benefits for all. I'm going to start by sort of painting a wide picture. The California Latino GDP calculation that we'll be releasing today is nested within the broader US Latino GDP calculation that we performed and released in a report about a month ago. And that, again, is part of a broad 8-year initiative with 30 separate reports. And so to sort of set the table, what I want to highlight is that no matter which of those 30 reports you look at, today we're going to see an incredible example in the 2025 California Latino GDP. But no matter which report we look at, what time frame we're talking about, what geography, whether it's the entire United States, whether it's a particular state or metropolitan area, we see the very same patterns. And that is that Latinos enjoy economic growth premiums relative to non-Latinos. And we see this in every geography, and we see this across a wide range of economic indicators. To give you some examples from the United States, the Latino labor force in the United States is growing nearly 8 times faster than the non-Latino component of the US labor force. Educational attainment, the number of Latinos who are earning bachelor's degrees or higher education is growing more than 3 times faster than that of non-Latinos. And Latinos are much more likely to be actively working than their non-Latino counterparts. Latino labor force participation today in the United States is 6 percentage points higher than that of non-Latinos. And in fact, that that participation premium, 6.7%, currently sits at an all-time high. And this underscores that Latino participation in the US economy and in the California economy is more active and more intense. And the vitality of the broader economy depends on that activity, that intensity, those contributions. And again, that's to say the large and rapidly growing economic contributions of Latinos are driving economic growth and producing benefits for all. Now, to just take real quick and share with you the most recent US Latino GDP calculations that will be the basis for our California Latino GDP calculations. It's important to realize first that 2023 is the most recent year for which the core official government data programs that we use as building blocks for the Latino GDP are available. So we're able to provide a snapshot of the economy and of the extraordinary contribution of Latinos in 2023. In 2023, the US Latino GDP surged past $4 trillion for the first time in the history of the country. And to give you a sense what $4 trillion is, if Latinos living in the United States were an independent country, the Latino GDP would be the 5th largest GDP in the world. That's to say that the economic contribution of Latinos in the United States is larger than the entire economy of the country of India. So 5th largest GDP in the world. Over the entire period that we study, from 2010 to 2023, the Latino GDP is the 3rd fastest growing GDP, again, over that entire period. In fact, only India and China's GDP has grown more rapidly since 2010. And as you can see, that the US Latino, the overall growth of the US economy is significantly slower. In fact, from 2010 to 2023, the US Latino GDP grew 2.7 times faster than the GDP of non-Latinos living in the United States. You can see here in the chart that from 2010 to 2023, the Latino GDP grew a total of 75%, compared to only a total growth of 27% for non-Latinos in the United States during that time. Now, at its core, when we look to the dramatic growth of Latino GDP, what we're really documenting here is a tremendous story of human capital of accumulation, of Latinos making investments in themselves, bettering themselves, bettering their families and their communities, and in doing so, again, producing benefits for all, right? Producing rising standards of living, greater social mobility for all Americans. From 2010 to 2023, the number of Latinos earning a bachelor's degree or higher education, as I mentioned previously, grew 3 times faster than the educational attainment of non-Latinos. And again, this is widely understood, educational attainment, as being one of the single most important ways of increasing productivity, accumulating human capital. Latinos are also forming human capital by way of strong labor force participation and accumulation of work experience and tenure. And as you see here, from 2010 to 2023, Latino labor force participation has always been higher than that of non-Latinos. And in fact, with the exception of 2021, that growth, that premium, the participation premium, has grown larger and larger every single year since 2010. And in fact, in 2023, the most recent year that we have data here, is Latinos are 6 percentage points more likely to be working or actively working than their non-Latino counterparts. Now, that's the basis. So there's this tremendous story of growth from 2010 to 2023. But we have to address the last few years, 2019 to 2023, because of the extraordinary event that is the COVID-19 pandemic and the tremendous differential impacts that Latinos in the United States suffered as a result of the pandemic. In fact, there's a common narrative that David will expand on in his part of the presentation, where it was assumed by many that because Latinos were more likely to work in frontline jobs, more likely to contract the disease, more likely to die from COVID-19, that this was the end of the story for the Latino GDP and its tremendous growth since 2010. But what's amazing is that when we look at COVID-19 and the tremendous impacts that Latinos suffered through the lens of the Latino GDP, the traditional narrative falls apart. Yes, it is true that Latinos suffered much higher rates of contracting disease. They suffered more COVID-related mortality. But it's evident in the data that Latinos held up the economy during the darkest days of the pandemic, served in vital roles in the economy, held the economy up. And this really bears out in tremendous economic growth premiums during the pandemic. So despite extraordinary challenges of the pandemic, Latino incomes since 2019, since the onset of the pandemic, surged 18 times the growth of non-Latino incomes. This is real income adjusted for inflation. You can see here that from 2019 to the most recent year for which we have data, Latino real income grew a total of 20% in the United States, compared to only 1.1% for non-Latinos. So this is a tremendous story of Latinos not only driving growth since 2010, but actually being a tremendous source of resilience for the broader economy during the darkest days of the pandemic. And in fact, the performance of Latinos holding up the economy was sufficient that since 2019 and since the onset of the pandemic, the Latino GDP is now the single fastest growing GDP among the 10 largest GDPs, surpassing China. And you can see here that the overall US economy, in fact, is a more distant fourth place by this ranking. So this is a tremendous story of where growth is coming from in the United States. And again, as we'll talk about some of the investments that can be made to ensure that growth into the future. Now, we're here to talk about California and to publish and discuss for the very first time a new vintage of California Latino GDP figures. This is a unique moment in time because the 2023 California Latino GDP, in 2023, the California Latino GDP broke through a very important milestone, surpassing $1 trillion for the first time. So that's to say the total economic contribution of Latinos in California is now greater than $1 trillion. Remarkably, Latinos living in the state of California represent a consumption market of $732 billion, larger than the entire economy of the state of Virginia or Michigan. And as we saw in the United States, GDP growth, Latino GDP growth, it has a significant premium in California. In fact, generally speaking, over many, many decades, California's GDP has grown more rapidly than the US GDP. And what's remarkable here is that despite the premium enjoyed by California relative to the United States, we see that the California Latino GDP is growing even faster than the broader California economy. In fact, growing 2.1 times as rapidly as non-Latino GDP in the state. So $1 trillion, what does that mean? How big is that? Well, if California Latinos were an independent US state, their GDP would be the equivalent of the 6th largest state GDP in the nation. In fact, the economic contribution of Latinos in California is larger than all of the economic activity in the state of Pennsylvania, larger than the entire state economy of Ohio, and is approaching the economic output of the state of Illinois. Now, Latinos are making contributions in California across every single sector. In fact, of the 15 sectors that we see here, we see dramatic contribution by Latinos across every corner of the California economy. So in California, in 2023, the top 5 Latino GDP sectors were finance and real estate, where Latinos had a total output of $137 billion, professional and business services with over $100 billion, government services, retail trade, and education and healthcare. Interestingly, the Latino segment of the California economy is broader and more diverse than the overall California economy. And what you can see here is there's actually 7 different sectors where Latinos have an outsized impact, where this sector is a larger share of the California Latino GDP than it is of the broader California economy. So for example, non-durables manufacturing is 5.9% of the California Latino GDP when it's only 4.2% of the overall California economy. So these are sectors: agriculture and natural resources, construction, non-durables manufacturing, retail trade, transportation and warehousing, leisure and hospitality. These are sectors where Latinos have an outsized impact in the California economy. Now, what's interesting actually is, again, that what this underscores is just how broad and diverse the Latino segment of the California economy is. In fact, when we look at the non-Latino segment of the California economy, what's amazing is that there are just 4 of the 15 sectors that account for 54% of the overall state economy. So California's economy is highly concentrated. 4 sectors account for 54% of the state's economy. Yet, we see that the California Latino economy is broad and diverse. And that's to say that Latinos provide a broad foundation of support, right? That is a further source of resilience in the ups and downs of the national and the state economy. Now, looking at the drivers of GDP growth in California, Latinos are making strong and consistent contributions to California's population and labor force. These are critical drivers of the rapid growth of the California Latino GDP. In fact, from 2010 to 2013, Latino population growth was nearly 8 times that of non-Latinos. In the case of both population and labor force growth, you're going to see that the premium enjoyed by California Latinos is even larger than the premium enjoyed by US Latinos generally. So from 2010 to 2023, the Latino population grew 16.2% compared to only 1.9% for non-Latinos. What's really remarkable is to look at the last 4 years here in this chart. What we can actually see is that since the onset of the pandemic, California's non-Latino population has been declining in every year. And yet, the contribution of California Latinos to the California population has kept overall population growth positive in 3 of those years. The story with the growth of the labor force is even more dramatic. From 2010 to 2023, the Latino labor force in California grew 15 times that of non-Latinos, a total of 24%, compared to only 1.6% for non-Latinos. And once again, you see since the onset of, at least from 2021 onward, the non-Latino labor force in California has actually shrunk in every single year. And yet we see strong and consistent contribution of Latinos. As with the United States, the story of the rapid growth of California's Latino GDP is very much a story of human capital accumulation. Again, of Latinos bettering themselves and in doing so producing GDP growth that benefits all. In California, the number of Latinos earning a bachelor's degree or higher education is growing 3.4 times faster than that of non-Latinos. Again, a premium that's slightly larger than the national as a whole. And from 2020 to 2023, Latinos' labor force participation rate has been consistently higher than non-Latinos in California. And that premium grew from 5.1 percentage points in 2010 and currently sits at 5.6%. So Latinos in California are 5.6 percentage points more likely to be working than their non-Latino counterparts. Now, again, no matter where we look within the state, we see the unmistakable impacts of California. So this is a story that holds for the state as a whole, but we also see it in every corner. So just to highlight 2 different unique geographies, the Los Angeles metro area is the single largest MSA in California. It's also the largest MSA by Latino population. Latinos are 45% of the total metro area population. And Latino population growth in the LA metro is 2.2 times that of non-Latinos over the period that we're able to study here. Latino population grew 4.9% from 2010 to 2018 compared to only 2.3% for non-Latinos. To look at a very different geography in the state of California, the Great Central Valley, so the San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys, that area had a Latino population of 2.8 million individuals in 2018, 40% of the Central Valley population. But what's amazing here is that Latino population growth is 12.9 times, nearly 13 times that of non-Latinos. And in fact, Latino population grew 18% compared to only 1.4%. The labor force is an even more striking example. Were it not for Latinos, the labor force of the Great Central Valley would have contracted over the entire period from 2010 to 2018. Right? In fact, the non-Latino component contracted by nearly 2%. The Latino labor force in the Central Valley grew by 20%, pushing overall labor force growth positive for that entire period. So this is the story that we see in every corner of the state of California. Latinos are drivers of economic growth, producing benefits for all Californians. Again, to talk about the Latino GDP to talk about the COVID-19 through the lens of the Latino GDP is a really interesting exercise. And just as we saw in the United States, we see unmistakable evidence in California that Latinos held up the economy in the state of California during the pandemic, were a tremendous source of resilience, and are now driving economic growth as the pandemic recedes into the rearview mirror as we get farther and farther away. And so despite the extraordinary challenges, higher rates of mortality, David will get into some of the numbers related to that and COVID-19, we see that the California Latino GDP grew a total of 16% from 2019 to 2023, compared to only 7.5% for non-Latinos. And this is interesting in the context of headlines that we're reading about now. It was just announced by the governor's office about a month ago that California was propelled to become the fourth largest economy in the world, fourth largest GDP, moving up from the fifth spot. What's interesting is in 2023, when California was the number 5 economy behind Japan, Germany, China, and the United States, right? What we see is that without the tremendous contribution of US Latinos, the California kind of would have been the 8th largest GDP, merely the 8th largest GDP in the world. Now, we don't yet have the data to calculate the 2024 California Latino GDP, but if we just do a simple trend extrapolation where we assume that the most recent 3 years average growth rate continues for the California Latino GDP, we can estimate California Latino GDP. And under that base, very, very reasonable basic assumption, what we see is that today, if it weren't for the tremendous contribution of Latinos, California's GDP would not be the 4th largest GDP. It would once again merely be the 8th. And so that's to say, we understand where economic growth is coming from in the United States, right? Economic growth that produces benefits for all Californians. And so it's incumbent on us to understand what those drivers are, and then to make the investments that ensure GDP growth and the benefits that it produces for the foreseeable future. And so with that, I'm now going to pass the microphone over to my colleague, David, to continue the discussion.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Let me just continue the story because we need to understand that COVID wasn't the first challenge, or that currently in the political climate of 2025, that's just another challenge. In fact, ever since the Latino GDP came up on the world radar scope, it has always been challenged. To begin with, if you remember the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, when everything came to a halt, economies around the globe, actually, many contracted, and it took a very long period to really come out of the recession. Many economists think that it wasn't until about 2014, 2015, 2016 that we could say, actually, we were out of the woods. But during that period, the Latino GDP began its almost inexorable rise, broke into the top 10, and by 2019 was almost tied with France in terms of place at number 8 in the world ordering of economies by size. And this was driven by hard work, the good old-fashioned way. As we see here, the blue columns, Latino labor force participation rate. Clearly, 2007 took a whack out of everybody, but a very high rebound in the Latino labor force, not quite so high in the non-Latino. And ever since then, the Latino labor force participation rate has been substantially higher and has been increasing ever since about 2015. Part of this tremendous growth in Latino GDP is attributed to the good health of Latinos. Right prior to COVID, in fact, we see the Latino healthy lifestyle in full play. That is, compared to non-Hispanic white, the Latino age-adjusted death rate for heart disease was 30% lower. Likewise, for cancer, Latino rate was 30% lower. For unintentional injuries, about 35% lower. Chronic lower respiratory, nearly 40% lower. And stroke, about 10% lower. Lower, not higher, lower. But this is because of the healthy lifestyle. And we need to understand these are chronic diseases. If I breathe on you, I cannot give you a heart attack. That heart attack is a result of the lifestyle, what you have eaten, what you have drunk, what you have smoked, with whom you associate, how you find spiritual solace. These are all parts of the lifestyle. There's something in the Latino lifestyle that reduces your risk for heart disease by 30%. And that in turn led to the fact that in California, Latinos had a 3-year longer life expectancy than non-Hispanic whites. This has an effect in the economy. And as we look at the economic literature, Bloom, for example, in 2004 said, good health has a positive, sizable, and statistically significant effect on aggregate output. Well, you can imagine why. Now, that was the first challenge, and we saw how Latino GDP came out of it roaring. Then came the COVID pandemic, 2022. And remember, COVID is very different from a lifestyle. It is a communicable disease. I could breathe upon you and give you the coronavirus. And then things could spiral from there: illness, hospitalization, intensive care, being placed on a respirator, and finally, death. COVID was mortiferous around the world. Millions died. And Latinos, it was clear from the very early days of the COVID pandemic, were more likely to be dying of COVID-19 than almost any other group. And this obviously will have an effect on the economic productivity. For example, in a recent economics publication, they state the burden of disease reduces the number of active workers. And we saw that very clearly with COVID. In fact, at the national level, because of COVID, 176,000 Latinos were permanently removed from the US population, which meant if they were adults, they were not able to participate. If they're children, they're not going to participate. This simply reduced that population that would produce workers into the labor force. Now, there has been a long-standing narrative about Latino dysfunction, that somehow Latinos are weak, passive, incapable of much sustained effort. And so once it was clear that Latinos were being walloped by COVID, I started to hear rather strange notions as to what this would mean. So many economists said, well, for sure, now COVID-19 is erasing whatever meager gains that Latinos had made economically. Also, some said, well, that healthy Latino lifestyle is gone because of COVID. And in fact, just last year, a recently released report said that the Hispanic healthy advantage has disappeared, completely erased, gone forever. And it was true. It was very, very difficult for Latinos. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, COVID nationally was the #3 cause of death for Latinos. It was the #1 cause of death. Remember, it removed 176,000 Latinos from the population. And here we see the grim trend year by year, the cumulative number of deaths per 100,000 for California. So that by 2023, of every 100,000 Latinos, 529 had died, whereas for every 100,000 non-Hispanic whites, less than half that, 203, had died. So many expected the Latino GDP to be irretrievably damaged, that would never come back. But rather than disappear, the Latino GDP roared back to 3.7 trillion for 2022. And now it's 4.1 trillion for 2023. Now larger than India, and of course, growing faster than China. How did the Latinos manage to press through with such tremendous growth? Well, continuing the old-fashioned way. First of all, hard work, very strong work ethic. As we can see here from 2011 to 2023, the Latino GDP, or the Latino labor force participation rate has been consistently rising, while non-Latino has been consistently falling, and the premium, those percentage points higher, continue to increase year after year. But during the pandemic, this worked against Latinos. Latinos were far less likely to be in a job they could do at home, which means they were leaving the house every day, getting exposed. They were doing this while Latinos were more likely not to have health insurance of any kind. And of course, suffering the effects of the Latino physician shortage, and physicians are a key entry point into the healthcare system. In fact, over the nearly 40 years that we see this number, the number of Latino physicians per 100,000 Latinos has been dropping, whereas the number of non-Latino physicians per 100,000 non-Latino population has been increasing. We wanted to get a sense of order of magnitude, just what did this cost that growing Latino population and its GDP. So here we have some early estimates. The number at the top of each column, the blue column, is the amount of the GDP that we estimated for that year. Now for 2020 and 2021, there's a little yellow band on top. That is if the Latino GDP had continued its historic growth trend, what it should have been. So that, for example, in 2020, while we measured a GDP of 2.95 trillion, it should have been 3.1. And for 2021, we measured 3.16 trillion. It should have been 3.25. So you notice Latinos GDP growth didn't stop because of COVID. However, it certainly was sub-optimized. It took a bite out. That Latino GDP for 2021 could have been 250 billion bigger. It could have grown even more rapidly. So we're talking about a tremendous momentum. Yes, COVID slowed it down a little bit. Without that, we estimate there would have been an additional 250 billion in the Latino GDP. But COVID did hit. We lost 176,000 Latinos nationally, 42,000 Latinos here in California, and they'll never, ever be able to make a contribution again. So COVID is now dropping in the rearview mirror. Here we have from 2020, the Latino and non-Hispanic white rate. During 2020, 2021, the Latino rate was quite a bit higher. They both dropped by 2022. In fact, by 2023, the Latino age-adjusted death rate for COVID is actually slightly smaller than for non-Hispanic white. So we just came out of the COVID crisis, then along come the budget crises of 2025, 2026. Now, as we look at the labor force participation rate just for 2023, the Latino participation rate is 68.1% versus a non-Latino of 62%. And that is nearly a 6-point difference, percentage point. And it's important, where do Latinos work? Latinos consistently are more likely to work in the private sector than non-Latino, less likely to work in the public sector. And for California, by the way, both this higher labor force participation rate and this higher rate in the public sector, I have calculated going back to 1940. So we're talking about nearly 85 years of data. This is not a one generation or one seasonal phenomenon. This is just simply the way Latinos are. Latinos work harder, work more in the private sector, work less in the public sector. And Latino households tend to be larger, more than one person larger than non-Latino. This means actually you have more wage earners per Latino household. You also tend to have more children per household. This is important because a lot of expenditures are made around household needs. For example, buying furniture, buying goods, buying food, buying a house. These are often driven by household size and household needs. So California has come back to the healthy Latino lifestyle advantage. Again, 30% lower death rates generally throughout the causes of death. We're still returning back. We don't have yet the 2023 data. So we have 2022, when the Latino life expectancy was only 2 years longer than non-Hispanic white in California. In the country, Latino life expectancy is a full 3 years longer than for non-Hispanic white. And at the other end, giving birth to healthy babies. Latinos in California have a lower percent of low birth weight babies than white non-Latino. This is important because low birth weight can be a risk factor for other untoward events such as infant mortality later on in life. Likewise, at the United States level, Latinos have quite a bit lower percent of low birth weight babies. Now, what's going to happen in the future? Here we have the Latino population in the state of California kind of sliced across by 5-year age groups. So this column are all Latinos in the state age 0 to 4. Here are all Latinos age 5 to 9, etc., 10 to 14. And within each column, we have in dark blue the numbers who are first generation immigrant. In light, well, sort of mid blue, the second generation children of immigrants. And in the very, very lightest blue, the third plus generation of immigrants, grandchildren, and more. So you notice, if you look at the immigrant portion in California, that it is very much centered around the older age groups. The median age of an immigrant in California is about 50 years approximately. But as you get to the younger age groups, the portion that is immigrant drops swiftly. And in fact, by the time you get down to the age groups 19 and younger, those age groups are about 96% born in the United States. Now, this is important because this is how you get Latino labor force growth. If you noticed, if you remember from your calculus, who forgets their calculus, the area under the curve for the really dark portion here, then you look at the area under the curve for the middle blue and very light blue. Well, this middle blue and light blue is about twice the size of this. And this has tremendous meaning for when people get older. In the Latino population, for every Latino that ages out of the labor force, turns 66, two basically of their children will age in. Remember, the younger ages, the median age of US born Latinos is about 20 years. So to begin with, that's a 2-to-1 replacement that gives labor force growth. Whereas in the non-Hispanic white population, for every one that ages out, a half of one ages in. So that's why that labor force is slowly declining, whereas the Latino labor force actually has fairly robust growth. But there's more. It's not just simply 2-to-1 workers. The younger workers, compared to their immigrant generation, have far higher levels of educational attainment. So that amongst the younger Latinos aged 25 to 29 in California, almost 92% have graduated from high school versus 61.7% of their parents. And then nearly half, 49.9% of US born Latinos go on to college versus about a fourth of their immigrant parents. So we're getting a 2-to-1 replacement with much higher levels of education. And it just so happens that younger, healthier workers compared to older workers are more energetic, more robust. They tend to be more productive. And of course, they're going to have fewer absences from work. This is all very good for the growth side of a GDP. So now let's look at the entire state of California. And I'd like to introduce to you the entering California labor force of 2040. Ta-da! Okay, here we have the entire California population, again, arranged by age group. And here we've done this by race ethnicity. So the dark blue is the non-Hispanic white, the mid-range blue are Latino, the very lighter blue are Asian, red is African American, and then the very lightest on top are the others. So you notice that the non-Hispanic white population is ranged more towards the older age groups, the baby boomers here, the echo boomer here, but then their presence in the younger age groups falls off tremendously. That in fact, in the entering the population will be entering the labor force in 24 is this 0 to 4-year-old one. That is 80% not white. It used to be called minority. When it's 80%, it's not really a minority. It's even more than a supermajority, of which over half, about 52%, is Latino. These children born in 2023 enter the California labor force in 16 years, beginning in 2040, and they will work most likely until 2090. This is the future of the California GDP. Will this entering labor force have the investments made so that California as a whole can continue to produce at a world-class level? Well, if it's up to Latinos, certainly all the basics are there in terms of labor force growth, labor force participation, population growth. The question is, will we be willing and able to invest in those young workers now so that they can carry California into the future up till the year 2090? And a very important item here is that around 40% of births in California are covered by Medi-Cal. Medi-Cal is an investment in the California economy of 2040, 2050, 2060, 2070, 2080, and 2090. Increased expenditures on improving health might be justified purely on the grounds of their impact on labor productivity. These are the most important investments we can make now, not in 5 years or at change of administration, now in these young workers who will carry this state up to 2090. Matthew and I in our group of the US Latino GDP feel it's really important that we keep a close eye on things as they develop. So this is our wish list of what we want to do, we feel needs to be done so that we can all keep a finger on the pulse of what is happening to the future labor force. To begin with, we need to do the California Latino GDP update every year, not every 5 years. We need to do it every year. And even that can be sped up by doing an economic development dashboard. There will be some economic data that we can put in almost every month. And we want to start doing some Latino GDP nowcasting with some significant data points. We can start to get a good estimate of what's happening because we have traced some of these behaviors back to 1940. And we also want to really pinpoint some regional Latino GDPs. The Great Central Valley, for example, has some rather unique characteristics, the Bay Area, and we need to update the LA Metro, Inland Empire, and Silicon Valley. This is our wish list, it's our agenda, but we need to find resources. So if anyone out there can offer us resources, get us to some resources, we'd love to chat with you because we need to start this next week because decisions are being made in Sacramento and in Washington that can affect what happens in California by 2090. So this is our page. You can look us up. You get our previous 29 reports. This is now our 30th. And please join us so we can better understand the Latino role in California for the next 60 years. Thank you very much. Back to you, Cecia.
Thank you so much. And thank you both for that powerful presentation. This truly is key data that our decision makers can use as they face very important budgetary decisions. During the presentation, we did receive a couple of questions from the audience. So let me invite both of you back up with us, and perhaps each of you can provide your thoughts to each of these questions. So let me look here. The first one, given the data, how would you describe the ripple effects on California's economy if we fail to keep Medi-Cal expansions in place?
Well, I have dipped into the economics literature to give some general sense from economists what happens with investments in health and healthcare. What we want to do is then drill down to actually apply them here in California so we can give California specific numbers. So we're going from general principles to what we would like to do. And that's going to take some additional work, for the which let me turn to Matthew to describe a little bit how we're going to do this and what we need to get it done.
Well, first, just to address the broader question, one of the things that I hope is evident in the research that we've been doing is, first of all, we're trying to provide a factual view of the economic contribution of Latinos, the extraordinary contributions of Latinos, and that we're really working from sort of an asset mindset, right? That what's key from a policy perspective is to invest in economic growth, because economic growth produces benefits for all of us: rising wages, higher standards of living, greater social mobility. So understanding what those drivers are, and then making investments to ensure even greater growth, because using this asset mindset, that means there's a return on investment. So these are critical investments that will produce benefits for all. And so obviously, what's amazing about Latinos in California, as in the United States as a whole, is that there's a critical doctor shortage. They have less access to health insurance, yet they enjoy even stronger health outcomes on average than non-Latinos. They start businesses at a higher rate, even though they have less access to capital, to commercial capital. Their home ownership rate, there wasn't time today to talk about home ownership today. Their home ownership rate is growing at a multiple of non-Latino home ownership in California, yet they have less access to to credit and personal capital. And so what that means is that this extraordinary growth that we already see can be multiplied, magnified, and in a way that benefits all. And so these are critical investments that need to be made. And obviously, the discussion about Medi-Cal is very, very acute right now because these budget decisions are being made as we speak. And so I think this is timely. Obviously, our dream research agenda is actually to use the Latino GDP framework to actually calculate what that return on investment is. We just have an interesting natural experiment in COVID-19 and the health impacts of that. And so we believe that this is a powerful framework for actually putting numbers on what the costs and benefits are of investments of this type.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that asset framing, an abundance mindset, right? And that's what we at LCHC always try to center, that as a public health framing and looking into all of our impact in that public health framing, the goodness doesn't stay just within the population. And this is a question that specifically ties to that. Do these investments benefit just the Latino community, or do they expand to the whole state?
So this is unmistakable in that economic growth produces benefits for all. So and this is, in some ways, this is kind of a fundamentally American story, right? That people invest in themselves, enjoy the benefits of those investments in themselves. In doing so, increase their productivity, it produces GDP growth, and we see this again and again. That GDP growth, more rapid GDP growth, produces rising standards of living for all, greater social mobility for all. And so that one is not difficult to answer. That these are investments that will benefit all Californians.
Thank you for that one. And then let me frame this next question. So when we talk about Medi-Cal and other safety net programs, there's always a bottom line, right? And there's always conversation around the cost. How do we reframe at the state level? How do we reframe this conversation around programs that protect our health and our well-being, not as a budget line item to be trimmed, but as an economic investment with measurable returns?
Well, in the presentation that we just gave, we are able to give an order of magnitude estimate from which we could start to infer some of the answers to those questions. I mean, when we know that at the national level, the COVID-19 pandemic that removed 176,000 Latinos from the population also simultaneously slowed down the Latino GDP growth, which was pretty good nonetheless, but slowed it down by 250 billion. So we know there's something going on there. And as we gain the resources necessary to do the work, we can start to drill down both at the national and at the state level to refine it so it's more than an inference, more than an estimate. Matthew, you want to add into that?
Yeah, well, I would just add that obviously, this is true for the United States in general, and it's acute in California, which is that the real economic challenge of the next few decades is growth of the labor force, is having workers to produce economic output, right? And so we know that as the baby boomer retirements crest, that we expect about 300,000 mostly non-Hispanic white baby boomers to leave the labor force every single month. In fact, that timeline, we may have already reached that because of COVID and its effect on the labor force. So this is a challenge. This is a real challenge. This is the economic challenge of the next few decades. And obviously there's a real nexus between healthcare, health outcomes, and labor market participation, as David documented with those academic citations that he provided.
Yeah, thank you for that. This next question delves a little bit deeper into that nexus. What does the data say about the connection between improved health outcomes and labor productivity in the Latino community?
Well, again, I was delving into the literature, and this is the general consensus. But now we need to drill down. Okay, here's a general consensus, but what does it look like here on the ground in California? So those would be the next steps that we need to take.
Perfect. And then just for both of you, this question, if You know, you have the governor in front of you today. You have the amazing legislators representing us in front of you today. What is your message from each of you to them today?
You want to take a crack, Matthew?
Yeah, so I would just appeal to what the governor already knows, is that economic growth is really, really important. This is one of the ways that the governor measures his own performance, right? Is the growth of the California economy. And after reminding him of the importance of that, appeal to reason that we understand what the drivers of growth in California are. Latinos are drivers here. We understand what are the sources of resilience for the economy. And then it simply follows. So let's make the investments that continue and amplify that growth in the years ahead.
Likewise, if we want to keep the California economy competitive, we want to keep the United States competitive, because we see the same thing at the national level. Going out to the year 2090, those investments are the ones that we make today, not in the next administration or the administration after that. Today, 2090 begins. Today, the labor force of 2040 is just taking its first steps. Today, we need to make those investments if we want California and the United States to remain competitive throughout the rest of the 21st century.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much. Once again, thank you to both of our amazing presenters for sharing such powerful insights. Today's conversation made one thing undeniably clear: Latino health is not just a moral imperative, it is an economic necessity. With Latinos driving California's workforce, GDP, and future growth, investing in Medi-Cal expansions is not just good policy, it's smart economics. And to all of us here today, let's carry this message forward in every room that we're privileged to be in. When we invest in Latino health, we invest in California's strength and economy. Thank you to our audience for joining us today, for being part of this vital dialogue. We will be sharing a recording of the presentation today and a couple of extra materials that we'll be sharing with you all. Thank you so much again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye now.